This is our route that we've taken in our past weeks. We've gone clear to the Dead Sea. We're coming back now to the north. And as a famous philosopher said, if you come to a fork in the road, take it. We're going to spend a little time at Jericho and the place where we were baptized and then go up to Jerusalem. When you read in the Bible about going up to Jerusalem, you're not in the north heading south or in the south heading north like we call up north and down south and that kind of thing. It's because Jerusalem is the high place. It's the spiritually elevated of all places. And so anywhere in the world when you return, people that move into the land even, they say they're making Aliyah. Aliyah means going up. So we're going up to Jerusalem. First of all, we're going to take a quick stop in Jericho. And I don't have too many pictures of the city of Jericho, but when you come to the tell of Jericho, this is the entry, and water from the spring that was the water supply for Jericho clear back at the time of Joshua fit the battle. So this is our gang heading up to the top of the tell. Tell, remember, means hill. It's a hill of layers of archaeological remains of previous civilizations. This is how they think Jericho was laid out. The dark purple line here is the upper wall. It was on top of the hill. It was an upper wall that was made out of mud brick, and they used slime for mortar. We're told in another place in the Bible, Nebuchadnezzar, I think, did that. Slime is crude oil. Crude oil is all over the area of Sodom and Gomorrah and the Dead Sea. Remember I said the Sea of Asphaltus was the other name for the Dead Sea in those days. So anyway, so it was mud brick. Then the lighter color is a rampart, a sloped ramp that was plastered somehow, and down to a lower wall that was, the top half of it was mud brick, the gray area, and the bottom half was stone. So that gives you an idea of what it looked like in a cross section. And this is a shot from a ways off showing some of the digs that they did in that area. Now, different worldly archaeologists will tell you that this wasn't the right time, or that there's not evidence of Joshua in the Battle of Jericho. When we saw the patterns of evidence video in the past, they explained all that. But this is it. And they found jars full of grain there that indicates that the siege that was laid against that city when it fell was not a long duration siege, because usually when they were surrounded, it was kind of like the Indians and the cowboys in the fort. They'd surround them and starve them to death. Well, this proves that it was a 7-day, well, not 7 days, but a very short time of siege. This is a picture in the past of the northern wall, and you see the man circled down in the corner to give you an idea how much of the homes that were built between the lower and upper wall in that area. And that's kind of a picture of it with about 3 million less people than actually marched around the walls. This is some of the archaeology done in the past that found even civilizations lower than the last one of Jericho. And here I believe, I looked for a place where I could find some areas that looked burnt. We saw some lines of sediment that were definitely burnt. That city was burnt at the end, which fits the biblical record. So, and that is very possibly some of the wall structures, and then the dirt over the centuries it's crumbled with the mud bricks and that kind of thing that fell forward so that children of Israel could go straight up into the top of the thing. As we're leaving town, I tried to get a picture of this sycamore tree, if you remember the story of Zacchaeus. But I got a trifecta here. We got a secure Palestinian enterprise zone next to the shade tree. As we leave town, we go to the east and we go to the area near where that red X is. In that general area is where the Exodus ended. where Joshua led the children of Israel into the land before they fought in Jericho. It's also the general area where Elijah, the prophet, went across and the Jordan River backed up and dried up with the Exodus folks, and then again with Elijah when he went off to the east side somewhere over here and went up, ascended in the fiery chariot. And when Elisha, his understudy, who was given a double portion in his mantle, went back across the river, he slapped the mantle on the water and it dried it up again. So all that stuff happened in that same general area. Remember, I talked in the past about how the waters were held back clear to Adam when the children of Israel went across into the Promised Land. This map gives you a good idea of elevation. This is sea level. The Sea of Galilee is 700 feet below sea level, and it descends all the way to the Dead Sea. It's about 12 to 14. So obviously you can see a pretty good depiction of the topography there. So we're headed now to the baptismal area, and on the same road that goes to King Hussein or the Allenby Bridge, we come to this little spot, the Qasar al-Yahud. I'm not sure exactly what that means, but it's the baptismal area. On the way down, we pass these machines, and they're things that were used to clear mines from the previous wars. Up north, they used cows in the pastures as minesweepers, but here they had to use heavy machinery. No grass for the cows. Once the area's been cleared, we saw one great big section where they've been replanting palm trees to make a palm grove. Jericho means the city of palms, so this is another picture of restoration in that area. This is the baptismal area, and I took a picture here of people that were in ahead of us, and this is just to give you an idea what the place looks like. That water, or that rope with the buoys on it, is the border between Israel and Jordan. So we were told not to duck under the rope or we would be illegal aliens. And you can see the lush area around the Jordan there. It's a very tiny river today. They say it was maybe 10 to 100 times that big back in the time of Christ. Then as we leave there, we start for Jericho. I found this on a man's website, people that actually walked this path. The old road to Jericho is a few miles off to the north of where the new highway is that we took on the bus. But he said they covered 15 miles in elevation, which is about 15 miles distance. As the crow flies, about 12, and an elevation rise of about 3,400 feet. That's about 2/3 of a mile up across 12 to 15 miles. So you can see that it's a pretty steep go. So they're definitely going up to Jerusalem in that road. Jesus and all the pilgrims of his day traveled that road often. This is a picture of it and another rendition. Now this is where the Good Samaritan helped the man out, and the story of the Good Samaritan happened on that road. On our way, we stopped at a gas station. I took a picture of the pony ride at the Jericho Gas and Grub, and we head on up the hill, and we're going through desert. It's just amazing how dry and barren it is. One time we were there about Passover, and there was green grass, tiny little bit we could see. We get about halfway up and we come to a spot that's sea level in the middle of the desert. And I was the last one to get a ride on the camel ride they had there, so the guy put the headdress on me, so I'm the Arab with the white tennies. The camel, her Arabic name was Desert Rose. You can see the desert all around behind that, the backdrop. As we go on up the hill, we're getting closer to Jerusalem. We get into vegetation, and we're getting a little bit closer, and we see these settlements. This is what they call the settlements on all the hilltops east of Jerusalem. They're homes for Jewish folks, but they're also built there as a defense mechanism to keep enemy attacks from coming from the high ground in over Jerusalem. So we see dozens of them. And as we're traveling along, we finally come to this, which is the wall in that area. It only has to be a fence because there's nothing too close and nothing too dangerous right there. But as we get closer, it's a solid wall. And the reason for that is to keep vehicles with bombs away and to keep snipers from shooting into the traffic and that kind of thing coming across there. So it's a necessity, and it has been effective. We come up finally, we're almost to Jerusalem. We come to the first stoplight at the edge of Jerusalem, and I see a Kansas City driver. Go halfway around the world to run into somebody from the neighborhood. As we come into town, we get our first glimpse of the old walls of Jerusalem. Notice the bedrock cliff this is actually cut down by man to create a higher defense wall, and then the stone blocks above it. And as they cut all this down through this whole section of Jerusalem, they quarried that and used the stones to build the walls and the buildings around it. This was at the time of Solomon. So I'll talk more about that later. Then we come to the Jerusalem model, which is at the Israel National Museum. This model's, I don't know what, a block or two square. It's 1 to 50 scale, and it's made of tiny little stone building blocks, like oversized Legos almost, but they're made out of stone. It's a scale model, and it's pretty darn good. At the time of Abraham, Jerusalem looked like this. There was 3 ridges or 3 mountains, Mount Zion, Mount Moriah, and the Mount of Olives. And then there's 3 valleys. There's the Kidron Valley that's between the Temple Mount and the Mount of Olives. There's Tyropoeon Valley that's called the Cheesemakers Valley. I don't know, I think Tyropoeon means cheesemaker, whether that's a family name or an occupation. And this one comes down and around. This is the Valley of Gehenna, the Hinnom Valley, which is the representations of hell in many cases in the Bible. Give you an idea of modern locations on those mountains. We have Mount Zion down here, the Pool of Siloam, the City of David, the Temple Mount, Church of the Holy Sepulchre over here, and this is actually straight east of the Temple Mount. North wall of the city, and then Golgotha in the Garden Tomb area. And in that oval is where we just talked about, where the bedrock's cut through to create a dry moat, basically, at the north wall of the city. They say that Jerusalem has always been attacked by enemies from the north. They come in because this is high ground and attack, and this is way too steep to get into those areas. Map showing that same thing, and the location of Golgotha, the dome of the gold dome there, and Mount Moriah. So Mount Moriah was actually a long ridge, and Golgotha is part of that Mount Moriah, even though it sticks up as a little dome by itself. This is one of the main roads out of the city at the time of Christ. Damascus Road would go off that way, off to Damascus, and split to go down to Jericho somewhere in there. And this is called the Damascus Gate. All these things are significant as we go along. So back to the model. This area is the city of David. It's called the Fortress of Zion. It was actually the fortress of the area, just like the castles in Europe where people would live out in the suburbs around the castle, but if the enemy attacked, they would run into the castle for protection. I believe that the Fortress of Zion, the city of David, was actually similar to that. You see, it had real steep side hills coming up to a ridge. David's palace was probably about there. This is the Temple Mount, and so that gives you an idea of that. Again, the valleys that I mentioned, the Hinnom, the Tyropian and the Kidron Valley. And then all three of them come together and go down, and remember seeing that wadi that was down by the Dead Sea that was the Kidron Wadi, the dry riverbed where the storms washed out the road when Greg and Brent were there. So they all catch all the rainwater in that area. It's all stone up in there, so flash floods would occur. The three valleys together form the letter Sheen. And you'll see the rabbis praying and people give them the Aaronic blessing, and they hold their hand up like this with these two fingers and split here and their thumb out, and that's kind of the same letter. It's representative of the name of God. God told his children to worship on the place where he chose to put his name, and this is representative of that. Greg said there's another place in Shiloh that the valleys and mountains form the same letter. And then there's another place in the mountains that actually spells Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, Yahweh, in the mountains. So this is the Temple Mount. That's the temple. This court here is the court of the women. They couldn't go into the holy courtyard there where the men could, and mostly it was Levites in that area. And if the women wanted to see into that area, you could climb up on balconies and rooftop areas around it, and you could see down in it. The outer part is the courts of the Gentiles they talk about. This is the Antonia Fortress. Herod was friends with Mark Antony and Cleopatra fame. And so that was the Roman fortress that they could actually look down into the temple courtyards and all that. And if there was any kind of ruckus or disturbance, which happened with Paul when the Jews tried to take him off and stone him, that's where they could see the activity and go down and intervene. On the north side of this model, this is a little bit off because it doesn't show the cuts through the stone on the solid stone, the dry moat in that area. It's depicted as all blocks, but that's the area where Solomon's quarry is, and this is Golgotha here. So at one time this ridge came all the way across. They quarried all this out, took the stones and built the walls and buildings around in Jerusalem, and they stopped at Golgotha because it said that it's junky stone. It wasn't quality enough to be a building stone. And that reminds me of the stone that the builders rejected when Christ was called that. It was along the main highway here and here that went to Damascus. After we went to the museum, we went to our second museum, the Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Museum. We couldn't take pictures inside, so and I think I widened Ben out just a little bit. He's not quite that wide, but we kind of stretched the picture to fit the frame there. So I noticed that, and I'm thinking, well, that's probably not flattering to Ben. But anyway, in that area is a grove of trees down a walk. It's a garden for the righteous Gentiles during the Holocaust. So they planted a tree or invited people, family members, to plant trees in honor of their loved ones who helped the Jews out during the Holocaust. And this is that walkway. There's one tree in particular we had recognized from Schindler's List, Oscar Schindler's tree. And there's another one over here that's dedicated to Corrie ten Boom, and many more like that. There's a building there that President Trump spoke from that podium. It's not part of the Holocaust Museum per se, but it's another memorial spot. It has all the death camps, all the cities where the different gas chambers and death camps were from Hitler's mess there. Anyway, and this is some of the pictures of it. This in particular is just heartrending. They have it is an underground or built into the ground children's museum. And the children's museum is a dark room full of mirrors. and candle lights flickering all over, great numbers of them. They say I've heard once one, read 3, and heard another time 5, but there's a small number of candles that look like the stars of the sky as they reflect from one mirror to another and light the whole place up. And as you're walking through, you hear a loop of, I don't know, hundreds of thousands of names of little babies that were lost in the Holocaust. And it's a pretty gut-wrenching thing. Anyway, and that's an artist's depiction of the horrific thing that went off with those spikes drilled into the stone above it as we go into that place. Then we go to Shiloh. Shiloh, for 369 years, was a place where the tabernacle in the wilderness was resided, and where every year, 3 times a year, the people from Israel would go and celebrate the feast of the Lord. It is 369 years is longer, almost as long as from now back to the Puritans, to the Pilgrims. This is the entry into the place there in Tel Shiloh, Shiloh they call it. And when we walk up the path, we look off to the right and we see this village, which is modern day Shiloh. And if you look at that, this is a picture of it. It's a Torah school, a yeshiva there. And next to that, down the hill a little bit, is this synagogue, which is built in the shape of the tabernacle of the wilderness. Then we come into a place that's a Byzantine chapel that's next to it. This thing was built 500 years after Christ, so at least that far back they recognize this location as Shiloh. And there's a glass case with a model of the Holy Tabernacle in it. We go up to the visitor center and look down toward the north, and we see this area, and it is said to be the plateau of the tabernacle down in there. So around where these flags are somewhere in here was where the Ark of the Covenant stood for almost 400 years. Off to the valleys and hillsides around there, imagine this whole thing full of campers, not Winnebagos or horse-drawn RVs, but tents and guys with their donkeys and camels. And so the people of Israel, all the men of Israel and their families would come back and celebrate and live around there for a week, twice a year, and one day at Shavuot, at Pentecost. Off to the north is a highway that runs off to Shechem, or Shechem they call it, a place where Jacob's well was. Joseph was buried after they brought his bones out of Egypt, and also Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim, which were the mountains of blessing and cursing. And as we look at the Bible, blessings and cursings you get a real good grasp on that if you read in Deuteronomy. Just look up the blessings and cursings that Moses talks about. When we come back, we're at a spot that we haven't been to since 2011, or our tour hasn't, last fall, but it's a good spot to get a perspective, but kind of like I did on Mount Carmel. This is a synagogue, or a cemetery for righteous Gentiles, where they're buried, like Oscar Schindler, and that's his grave where those 2 people are standing. This is what his grave looks like. Graves in Israel are honored not by putting flowers on them, but by putting rocks on them. Their loved ones will apply rocks because it has more permanence. And probably very short periods of time, and that thing has to be cleaned off because there's more and more rocks all the time from visitors. So when we're standing in that general area and we look off to the east, we see in the circle there the dome of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the gray domed mosque on the Temple Mount. We see the south wall of the temple, that's the top part of it, it's that oval. We see the Mount of Olives and all the graves on the Mount of Olives. Now, it's full of graves. It's just covered with graves, and the reason being because A lot of people have been able to read in the Old Testament that Jesus, or the Messiah, they look for the first coming, but that Christ will come back and put his foot on the Mount of Olives. And that's time of resurrection. So they want to be, people are paying big bucks. I've heard, I don't know for sure, but maybe up to $500,000 for a burial site. So they can be close to the resurrection, be one of the first ones resurrected, so to speak, when Christ comes back, or when their Messiah comes the first time. That's the south steps of the temple that we'll see and talk about quite a bit. Then we look off to the kind of the south and southeast, and we see the Hinnom Valley again. This is Gehenna, that's representative of hell. It's the place where all the rubbish was thrown, the dead animals, it's the city dump. They constantly were burning rubbish in that area, so it was a place where the fire was never quenched and the worm never died from the, worms eating the rot. And so that's generally a Hinnom Valley. And then we look over the Hinnom Valley into the south, and we see this area. And off a little bit toward this side, they call the Hill of Evil Counsel, because that's where David's son tried to do a coup to take over the kingdom from David. His name was Absalom. So that's the Hill of Evil Counsel. There were other things that were done there, much like that. And then off a little bit in this direction, is the road from Bethlehem coming up. So that's probably about where Abraham and Isaac first saw Mount Moriah, where Isaac was about to be sacrificed in their minds at that time. We leave that area, we come to Mount Zion, which is just on the west side of that cemetery, walk up the road a little bit and turn to the right, turn to the left, and come into an area called King David's Tomb. Now this is a Crusader building today. It was probably built sometime during the period of the Crusaders, maybe 1000, 1100 AD or so. I'm guessing on that. But anyway, but it's built over some archaeological foundations that they think may have really been the first building of the tomb of David. You see a statue of David out in front with his harp, and we go inside, and there's a shroud over an area that's believed to be David's tomb. And it's a synagogue, and of course the men can go into one part and the women the other. In fact, I'll back up. Behind this screen is a women's area where they can view into that, but there's no connectivity between the two. And so this is a Torah study place and a place for prayer, and it was the most holy place before the 67 war when the temple was reconquered, because it was at that time closest thing they could get to the Temple Mount. As we go right up over the top of it, a room above that is the traditional upper room. They call it the centacle, where tradition holds that that's where the supper in the upper room was. And this is a depiction of the tree of life there, I think. As we leave that area, we go out further south. We go through some gardens and some real nice, maintained, beautiful area, and we come out into a barren knob at the end of the hill. This is an abandoned area, and it's got this kind of cage built over a structure. And down in that cage is a set of steps that goes down to a mikveh pool, an immersion baptismal type pool, and on down to a tunnel that goes off to the right and is dug back into a place where there's a little room back in there. And one theory is that this is the place where the first century church worshipped, or at least had use of. And found in that area in the 60s were 40 artifacts recorded in a book by a man named Fisher, and two men, Fisher and Smalls, that wrote a book about it. Supposedly, a Greek Orthodox monk kind of dug around in that area and found all this stuff, and they all had this symbol on it. This is a picture of the shooting through the cage, there's locked doors down into that area, and that's a baptismal pool. And then they all had this symbol on it, which today is recognized all over the place as some call it the Messianic seal. It's got the fish tail intertwined with the base of the menorah, and they believe that that may have been first century symbolism of Christianity. both Judeo-Christian concepts. Others contend with that. So I'll say that as a disclaimer, but I think it's pretty good. We go out of there and we go to the Zion Gate a little bit to the north, and this is the city walls of the old city, the first time we come to the walls of the old city on foot. And we see this area that's just a riddled, pockmarked all over the stone in that area, and that's all bullet holes. That's from the attack to try and conquer the city in 67, and I'm not sure if there are other battles there or not, but that was from the 6-Day War, I think. You see this little structure here, it's over every gate, it's a little protrusion like that. It's a place to pour boiling oil on the people that are storming the gates of your city. Throughout history, they have different times like that, and that's one of their defense mechanisms. They would pour boiling oil on their enemies. And these slots are for shooting arrows or, in later days, guns. They're narrow on the front side, so it protects the shooter pretty well, but on the back they widen out so you can get a broad range of target. As we come to the gate, you get a good idea of what the gates are like there. This car is going to come out of that gate. It's going to have to stop, back up, and stop and back up and turn and wiggle around to get out of it, but they can get a Toyota in and out of the gate even today. Most of the vehicles inside the old city are like gators or ATV type truck vehicles of some sort. You can't hardly get cars in there. There are places, but it's tight in the streets, and you can see that there's vehicles there. We come to this place called the Cardo. Cardo is like cardiac, like main artery. So it's the main artery of the city. It's our main street. It'd be, in the cowboy towns, this would be the main street of town. And so the center is for vehicle traffic, chariots and that kind of thing. Then a little raised areas off to the side like we saw up in Bet Shean. And this is a mural on the end of the wall that kind of depicts what life may have been like in those days. This is some of the original columns from that have been dug up and the wood that's been put over it to give you an idea what they look like. We go on down the way a little bit and we come into an area that's pretty much underground, or it's under buildings above. And this is part of the Jewish quarter. And if you go on down far enough, you come into an area that relates down by the Holy Sepulchre in that part of town to this. So you go from a fairly orderly, well-kept shops to just an amazing Middle Eastern bazaar. And I was looking at this, I didn't realize it's got underwear hanging, we've got money changers and balloons and anything you could want. And they tell us when we go through those areas to keep your hands in your pockets, because there might be people trying to get your billfold. We hang a right and we see this beautiful storefront. This guy's got an art gallery. I think it's called the Olive Press Art Gallery. And the doors and the window thing are all bronze and beautiful tile work. Go around the corner and we come to a street that's just about to open out onto a main plaza in the old Jewish quarter. Our friends Moshe and Dove have a shop right next to where this picture was taken. And in behind us is this structure that was dug out. They call it the Broad Wall from the time of King Hezekiah. And this gives you an idea what it looked like when they dug it out. And they built the city up over it, but they maintain and protect the archaeology of the past. Across the plaza, we see this building. It's another yeshiva, another Torah school. When they went to build this building, they started to dig, and everywhere in Israel, when you go to dig something, there's always an archaeologist assigned to the thing, whether it's fixing a sewer pipe or, burying your dog, which they wouldn't do, but, whatever. Anytime you go to dig, put a shovel in the ground, they look for archaeology. So when they started to put this building in, this is what they found. For quite a period of time, they found an enormous amount of ruins of rich men's and priests' homes. And that beautiful tile floor there is an example of kind of what they found in that area. And lots of, high-end artifacts there, pottery and tables and furniture and things like that. As you go through the place, so they made the basement of the building they were building a museum and kept the archaeology under it and then built on stilts above it, columns, whatever. So this is some of the place. This is a model of one of the homes they found there, and it kind of gives you what possibly may be, whoops, wrong button. When Peter came into the courtyard to warm himself when they took the Lord to be tried by Caiaphas, this place has a courtyard. So it may be this kind of a home structure that all occurred in. As we leave, well, and to give you an idea where that's at in relation to the Temple Mount area, this is still the walls of the Temple Mount today. None of this is the same, and that's a modern futuristic thing. But there's Wilson's Arch here that was a main passageway. A lot of the priests went up and down through here, and also the main water supply, which is a water pipe that's probably this big around and had a huge amount of head pressure on it. Supplied all the water for the Temple Mount, came from 11 miles away in a place called Solomon's Pools, which is up by Hebron. Anyway, that dig there under the wall museum's right back in here. So it's very close proximity to the Temple Mount, and it would have been a handy place for the priests to live. Also, we see a lot of mikveh pools in the basement, ritual immersion pools. So it's believed that the wealthy and the movers and shakers of the country, when they'd come in for the feast, would stay with the priests, and they would get to have private mikveh pools and private places to immerse and cleanse themselves before they went to the temple, so they didn't have to use the same places the common folks did. That's 2,000-year-old linoleum. As we leave town there, or leave that, not town, but that area, we come out and we're on a street now that's looking toward the security entrance to the plaza at the Wailing Wall. You see this ramp here. There's a security place where you empty your pockets and like getting on an airplane there, and here to go into the plaza in a separate area. And so this is the Temple Mount. This is the southwest corner. This is called Robison's Arch. It's what's left of a place called Robison's Arch that I'll come back to over and over and over again. As we go down below that street, kind of go down some steps and back around in under on a wall here is a picture of another rendition of the Cardo. This is a second Cardo that runs at the back of the Temple Mount Plaza that's called the Cotel that they've just excavated. Different time period, different Main Street. So then from that mural we look off to the right and we see the entrance into this archaeological park, which is an amazing thing. This is the area to the west and south of the Temple Mount that's all been excavated. And this is the area that we're going to be looking at. This is Robison's Arch. This is a way for pilgrims to come up the step street from the Pool of Siloam up toward the Temple Mount, go up here and up into the Temple Mount, or they can go through here and here with mikveh pools, ritual immersion baths in this area. Okay, so Robison's Arch looked like this in 1880. You could almost jump up and touch it. That's how much fill there was around there, and as the city had been destroyed and covered over, and there's a scripture in the Bible, God says there would be a place where it would be plow ground, and that's kind of what this looks like in 1880. Then in 1968, the year after the Six-Day War, they went to town. And remember, all this was done in an archaeologist fashion where they would take this dirt up a bucket at a time or whatever and sift it and look for artifacts and all that kind of thing. But this whole thing has then been dug out within a year, and it's still under dirt over in here, you can see, but there's been quite a bit of archaeology that's been done there. Off over in here, not so much yet. In 2002, this area has been dug out, all of this that was before, and now all of this. So it's an amazing thing. The enemies have come in times past, leveled the whole thing and pushed everything in, but they've been able, then once the Jews got it back, they were able to just go dig out the rubble, and there's still evidence of all their culture and history in that area. And in that circle is Robinson's Arch. And it's a long way down to the ground there. This gives you an idea. We're coming in on a level that's not as far down as the street below Robinson's Arch, and yet you can see how high it is there. And then we come up to that handrail we just saw and look down, and we see an area that has this feature in it. These were storefronts, places where they bought and sold goods and that kind of thing on the main street, with the arch coming up over it and then tying into the wall. This is what it looks like today. This was the street. This is the street Christ walked on. This is the street that Herod built. These boulders over here we'll see over and over. They're thrown down by the Roman soldiers in 70 AD. When we look at this thing, let's see. This area, this area, that ramp goes up to the Temple Mount. We'll go up there in a little bit. So then we go down, and this is a sign telling us about this street. This is the boulders the Romans threw down. This is part of the shops on that side of the wall. This area here, the keystone of the arch on Robinson's Arch, when that was knocked out, which let the whole arch fall, it fell on the ground right there. And back here where this little cage is laying and a ladder sticking up, that's a hole that goes into a storm sewer underneath the city street. Another picture of it, and this is at a later date, but same areas. Now, we're going to look at this next. This area, among the collapsed stones, they found this rock that had an inscription, said, "For the place of blowing," written in Hebrew. Every Sabbath, begin and end of the Sabbath, every feast day, all those kind of things, they would blow a trumpet to announce to the population, you know, kind of like the bell tower on the courthouse square, you know. And so then we look off to the east along the south wall, standing at that area. So we're over here and looking down this way. We see this south wall, and notice all the difference in the stones. Some of them are flat, some of them are big, some of them have borders around them, some of them have bulges on them. Each one of those from a different period of time. The bulges are Herodian stones from a different period of time, these smaller flat-faced stones, and then I said Herodian, Hasmonean, which is Maccabees. This is Herodian down in here, where they would cut borders around every stone. We go around this building, which was put in, it's kind of a room addition at the Crusader time, around 1100, but they built into an area that had enclosed half of an arch there. And there's two arches there. I'll show you in a minute. I backed away from it. But so this blocks off what used to be part of the down staircase from the Temple Mount. As we look off to the east and south, we see Mount of Olives, Silwan, which is the Arab section of town. Silwan is Arab for Siloam, so it's the same thing as the Pool of Siloam, the area of the Pool of Siloam. This is where Solomon housed his wives, and there's a name for that too, like the Hill of Evil Counsel, but I can't remember it. he kept them at arm's length and sent for them, I guess. You can't hardly see it, but there's a little dash line that runs down through here, right through the center of that arch. And that's where that building is today that I showed you just a second ago. So this is where they would immerse, go up an up staircase into the Temple Mount area, through a hallway and up some steps and pop out onto the Temple Mount. And then they would come back down this side. And this is that area today. This is the mikveh pool area, and in that circle, that's a 3-arched opening. And right over in here was that 2-arch that was held off by the building. And the steps in this area are formed in a special way. You have a real broad step and a narrow one. That's to keep people from hurrying up and down the steps to and from the temple, to encourage the attitude of reverence. Notice that some of the lower steps are carved right out of the bedrock of the mountain, and up higher it's blocks that are added. We come down then to the city of David. The city of David is this panhandle area, the part that Rami called the, what do you call it? The sausage, yeah, the Florida sausage. Yeah, so this is we're coming down into here now, up in here underneath an area where they believe David's palace was. So we come out onto a platform, enter the park, and go down some steps and see all this underneath. And this is especially interesting to me. That plaster on the wall is probably 3,000 years or better old, way before the time of Christ. Still plaster there. And in that area, they found hundreds of these things. They're seals, signet rings. You know, the rulers and the officials all had rings with the symbols of their name or whatever on them. They'd take a wad of clay when they, instead of licking the envelope, they would roll up a scroll, put a wad of clay on the edge of the thing, and stamp it with that seal. And when the clay hardened, then that was a sealed envelope or a sealed scroll, like we talk about in Revelation. One of those things they think was a seal from the prophet Isaiah himself. This one, I think, or more like it, is mentioned by a group that plotted against Jeremiah in the time of King Hezekiah. You go down and past that area, head a little farther south, and you come to you come down the step-stone structure, which is a foundational wall under David's palace, they believe. And you come to the house of Ahiel, or Ahiel, or however you say it. This is a 2-story house they found the remains of, and you can see here the upper and lower story of this house. And it was obviously a rich man's house, because that's a toilet seat. They had indoor toilets. Of course, that, you know, where I'm from in Iowa, that wouldn't be such a luxury, but in Jerusalem, it's not too bad. We pass on by it. Well, we look the other direction from that, and we see all these caves on the other side, and they are actually fairly wealthy people's tombs when they've been pillaged and ruined, but they found evidence of some pretty high-end artisan work in those tombs. Then we come to a place called Warren Shaft. That was a pit they dug, a tunnel straight down to the water source below. And this is Warren Shaft when you look down it. There's a set of stairs next to it. We go down and get to the bottom of it, and that's kind of down near an area where the water flowed for the city water for the fortress of David. This is what an artist rendering of that area at the time. The water source was this thing, the Gihon Spring. Gihon means gushing. So every exact few minutes or whatever it was, maybe every 20 minutes or whatever, the water would surge out of there, whether it flowed all the time and surged or, you know, was only bursts of water, I don't know. But anyway, that was the Gihon Spring, and the fortress that was built around it. Guard towers and that kind of thing around the spring that was just slightly outside the city. Then this is what it looks like today when we go down in there, and there's a lot more to it. I don't have time to show you all the pictures, but you know, it is the area of the Gihon Spring. And that, in the time of King Hezekiah, was attached to the pool of Siloam some great distance away. I can't remember how far it is, but it's probably between 1/4 and a half mile long. This is going down into Hezekiah's tunnel, and that tunnel connects to the Pool of Siloam. And when they found the tunnel, they went through the thing. It still has water in it. And they found the place where people started at both ends and dug toward the center. This is solid rock now. No GPS, no engineering kind of surveying things like we have today. They started at both ends. It winds around, and they wound up meeting within half a foot of each other and kind of did a little adjustment at the last minute, and then carved into the wall telling how they did it and what it was. My theory is that there was a crack running through that area, and as the spring gushed, there would be a little trickle of water that stopped and started at the other end of the Pool of Siloam, and they could have followed that crack. If that's my theory. Only a theory, but somehow they did that, and it's pretty amazing. We get to the Pool of Siloam. This wasn't found until 2004. Once again, the theme of restoration of all the things of the land. God just keeps bringing things up and out. The Pool of Siloam was found when they were digging to repair a water pipe. They hit a stone that looked like it was interesting, kept digging. So, let's see, this is what it looked like. It was a place where the people, the travelers, the people that came into town for all the feasts could immerse and go up to the Temple Mount on a long street about a half mile long from this area up to the place where we saw the cage on the Temple Mount street. So this is what they have of it. Over here, they had to quit digging. This is a wall of dirt, and a yard over here has got chickens running around in it. It's part of a church that's a Georgian church or some Orthodox church of some kind. So Israel doesn't own it, so they had to quit digging there. But you go on to the east, you see a spot where the water still comes down from the Gihon Spring, full of coins and well-wishers or whatever. People have thrown money in there. And we come to this sign, and it talks about the water pouring ceremony. Now, the Feast of Tabernacles, I don't know how much anybody may have read about the Feast of Tabernacles, but that's all the fall feast, the Feast of Trumpets, the time of Yom Kippur, and right after that is the Feast of Tabernacles. It's a week-long feast where people were to dwell in tents or temporary dwellings, which today we would see as representing our temporary bodies, the dwelling of our human bodies that we live in, and before we get to go to our long home. Anyway, part of that thing each each day of the week, I think, was a water pouring ceremony where a priest would come down with well, this is a picture of the temporary structures and the street coming down, and this is how far a priest would come off of the temple with a golden flask, dip water from the pool of the sent one, which Siloam means sent one, and the water was called living water because it was from a spring, and he would carry that flask all the way back up for a ceremony up here. So he would come down with his gold pitcher. He would dip into the water, the living water from the sent one. He would follow a guy that played a flute back up the mountain. The flute had holes pierced in it, like a regular little flute, and they called that guy the pierced one. So you had the priest ascending, you had him following the pierced one, and taking the medal of royalty and the living water back toward the Temple Mount. All along the way, you see the crowds all up through here. They would have had palm leaves and willow limbs, and they would be shaking and waving those things like crazy and hollering Hosanna and celebrating as the guy carried the water back up the hill. And they would come then to the Temple Mount area, and there would be thousands in that area with the women overlooking from the balconies above, and the men in the center of it and all that stuff, and they would come to the altar. And the priest carrying the golden vessel, would come up to the altar and he'd meet another priest, and that guy would have a silver vessel with wine in it. And then together they would pour out the wine and the water. Wine is representative of blood, like we do in communion. So at the very moment they're about ready to pour, and all that ruckus and all the noise that's going on stops. And it's believed that at that very time, John in 7:37 and 38 occurs. In the last day, the great day of the feast, Jesus stood and cried, saying, "If any man thirst, let him come to me and drink. He that believes on me, as the scripture has said, out of his belly will flow rivers of living water." So Christ right there was announcing that he was the Messiah. He was the one that was the fulfillment of that water pouring ceremony. Even later in the year, at the time of Hanukkah, a guy asked him if he was the Messiah, why didn't he say so? Not long before, he says, well, I just told you. Back in the, so to speak, he was hinting that he had just told him at the time of the Feast of Tabernacles and the water pouring ceremony. We start up the street now toward the Temple Mount, the same street that the priest carried that gold vessel, and the same street that Messiah walked on. And these are some of the pavers off the street that Jesus walked on. We go on up the way and we come to a drainage channel, which is the storm sewer under that street. Greg and Brent and several of them in 2011 were some of the first tourists ever to get to walk on that street in the public. This is a sign that's on the wall there. So you've got the depiction of going up to the Temple Mount and up the Robinson's Arch and in there. And then you get to the top, and whoever painted this sign did that. Put a gold dome from a Muslim thing that was at least 600 years after the time of Christ instead of the temple on the Temple Mount. So I still must have been a different artist, not a believer. Anyway, go up the steps and we're heading up the way. We dive in under and we go up about a half mile, about 800 yards. And as we go, it gets tighter. Your shoulders are pulled in. You're kind of ducking down and you're getting claustrophobic as you come up through this storm drain and continue up. And right before I went over in 2011 on the second trip later in the year, after Greg had been there, it was announced that they'd found that thing in the guy's hand. That's a gold bell that they think may have come off the priest's garment, the high priest's garment, and been swept off the Temple Mount platform before the Herodian street was built, and they found it in artifacts underneath. Also, there's an iron Roman sword there that would have had to do with the siege against Jerusalem, and the Romans killing all the Jews that were inside the city, and that storm sewer a lot of people hid in. And then this thing, which they say is supposed to be a menorah. Whether it is or not, I don't know. Anyway, you come out and you see daylight, you climb up a set of steps and come out in the cage on the street up under the southwest corner of the Temple Mount. Also in this area. Once again, we're going to talk about this same area. In John 8:56 and 59, he says, the Jews are contending with the Messiah, and he says, your father Abraham rejoiced to see my day, and he saw it and was glad. And they said, well, you're not even 50 years old. How could you have seen Abraham? And Jesus said, I tell you, before Abraham was, I am. He was telling them right there, the great I am. He was God. And so they were accusing him of blasphemy, so they started to pick up stones wherever they could find him on the Temple Mount, and we're going to stone him for being blasphemous, but he somehow hid their eyes and just walked right through them and left the Temple Mount. When he did, he was up here, and he probably, in John 9, then we're told that as he passed through, he saw a man that was blind from his birth, and some other verses, and then he said, and when he'd spoken, he spat on the ground and made mud, or made clay of the spittle, the same way he made clay to form Adam. And he anointed the eyes of the blind man with clay, and he told him to go wash in the pool of the Siloam, pool of Siloam, which is interpreted as sent, and he went it that way, therefore, and washed, came seeing. Now, that all happened probably right here at this double gate. Why didn't Jesus just tell him to go down a few steps and go into a mikveh pool, wash his eyes, and come out seeing? Instead, he told him to go a half mile down this long, steep street to go to the pool of the sent one with the living water and come back seeing. Now, I don't have the answer necessarily. Well, I don't have the answer to that, but when we see these things in the context of geography and placement, it opens up a whole new vista of things to try and search out and understand. And I'm sure that there's a living parable in that. Okay, so after that, we go up the ramp and we go to the Temple Mount. The Temple Mount is the place the Jews believe, or many Jews believe, was the Garden of Eden area. They also believe that it's the same spot that Abraham took Isaac to offer him as a sacrifice when God provided the ram for him to replace Isaac as a sacrifice. And they also believe that that's where the Temple Mount was, or the Temple of Solomon. And so when we get there today, that's all gone. What you see is a plaza that's 35 acres, paved, almost all of it, like the paver stones we have seen before. And it's now controlled by, Israel has the authority over it, but it's basically policy controlled by the Arabs, and so by Jordan. And so it's taboo for a Christian or a Jew to pray on the Temple Mount. Ben will tell you, we had a guy come up and accuse us of praying when we were listening to Rami. It was actually a good reminder, and we all probably were saying prayers right after that guy left. Off in here, well, this platform has been there so long that this tree is growing there, and that's, that's probably a 1,500-year-old tree or so. We see the gray domed mosque, the entrance to that right here, and their rendition of a holy laver out in front of it. I don't know what their teachings is on that, but I think it's probably just copycat, in my opinion. We look the other way and we look up above and we see the famous Gold Dome Mosque. We go up some steps to that area, and there's a lot of things we could talk about there, but I've honed it down to the Arab writing that goes around the top of the mosque. First of all, this is built in a hexagon. Some say that it was built in the same shape over an existing older Byzantine church, like the one around St. Peter's house up in Capernaum. May have been, don't know, but it was, for some reason they built it in an octagon. But this writing essentially is different scriptures from the Quran that says God has no son. And they're covering a rock that many believe is the same bedrock where the Ark of the Covenant stood, and it may be. The other place where bedrock is exposed on the Temple Mount is under this dome, which is to the north. And you can see the bedrock there, and about everything else is, paver blocks. Straight east of that is this gate, which they call the Golden Gate, or the eastern gate of the outer wall. The Turks walled this up because they know the scripture that says the Messiah will come back through the eastern gate. And so they thought if they'd wall it up, he couldn't come through. And then also on the outside of it, they put a whole Muslim cemetery in the assumption that a rabbi wouldn't go through, touch dead bodies or go through an area like that. That dome is right there. That gate is right there. Back in the time of Bill Clinton, he suggested when he was president, why don't we just split the thing up and have both up on the Temple Mount, put the temple here or somewhere up here, and leave the other part as the part that's left to the Gentiles. There's a scripture, I think, in Ezekiel that would says that the Gentiles would have an outer court and call this a house of prayer for all nations. Now, Christ called his Father's temple the house of prayer for all nations, but I don't think he had in mind what Bill was proposing. We come off to the north of that a little bit and we see the Lion Gate. The Lion Gate is where the soldiers in the 67 war came through. Then we go to Bethesda. Bethesda is a place where the sheep gates were and the sheep market pool where Christ told the man to pick up his pallet and walk. I was there once in the spring. It had water in it. The rest of the times the water evaporates and you don't get that opportunity to see the pool of Bethesda. But it's an awesome thing. Over it is a series of churches built one on top of the other through time, and you see all the archaeology of that above. You get an idea how far down the streets of Jerusalem may have been at the time of Christ. So the Via Dolorosa might be 20 or 30 feet above where it actually had streets below it in previous times. From there we go to the Temple Treasures Temple Institute, who is an organization founded by one of the guys that was up on top of that Temple Mount when they recaptured it in '67. And he feels the leading to create research and create replacement artifacts for the Temple Mount. And so they're building for a third temple. This is their old place. We were in a newer location about 2 or 3 blocks from there now, but all the different pieces of furniture for the third temple. You've got the altar of incense. This is one of the lamps off of the top of the menorah. Priest garments, high priest garments, one of the vessels, gold vessel for the water pouring. The menorah, this thing is wood covered in gold, and I don't know how much it's worth, but it's a bunch. They've got it under bulletproof glass outside on open display in the outside area. They moved it. This is last fall. They moved it a few blocks back from where it was, and this is the main courtyard there in the Jewish quarter. Then this is a box for the scapegoat, the drawing of lots. The priest at each year at Yom Kippur would reach into a box and draw one of these two out. For one was a sacrifice to the Lord, and the other one was for a goat that was taken off into the wilderness. So those two, that's what they have prepared for that. This thing is the table of showbread. I always envision this as being a few loaves of bread, a dozen loaves of bread stacked on top of each other. But these things are racks to hold enormous, huge loaves of bread that they have determined is what it should be. And this is the silver vessel with the wine for the pouring ceremony, some water vessels that are used there. Another deal with the silver vessel. This is the Temple Mount, the Wailing Wall. That yellow thing there, it doesn't show up as well, but right around here is the men's section. This is the women's section, and this is the main commons area. In order to go down into the prayer area down here, men have to cover their head with a kippah, and I think women may have to cover their heads too, I don't remember. Anyway, that's some of the worship that goes on there. That was a bar mitzvah. This is the women's area, and that's the main part of the kotel and worshiping at night. And some of the different things. In Matthew 15, the Jews asked Christ why his disciples didn't wash before they ate. He wasn't talking about hygiene. This is a ritual that the Jewish folks go through to be considered ritually clean, to touch food and eat. They grab one handle, they pour water over one hand, grab the other handle, pour it over the other, each time saying a prayer. Baruch atah Adonai, blessed be the name of the Lord who gives us the commandment of the washing of hands or something like that, which there's no commandment I've seen in the Bible to do that way. But so they do each side 3 times, and they accuse Christ's disciples of not doing that. So that's what they're talking about when washing hands. This is from Masada. They had stone cups for the same reason. Here's going down into the temple underground, the street at the time of Herod. We're up here, the Wailing Wall's here. We go down in under in a long tunnel back through here. It's called the Rabbi's Tunnel. Today they've got a synagogue opened up in here. This is original stuff that then they've put a platform and put some seating in, and that's a synagogue. As you go down past the synagogue, you come to this stone. This constantly amazes me. That man back there, his head's not hardly seen, that little spot back there, is the other end of that stone. It's 40 foot long, 12 foot tall, and 8 foot wide. It's as big as a semi-truck. Somehow they quarried that out, squared it up, put little blocks in these holes to lift it with, and shifted this thing in place. It's probably, I don't know, 1 million tons? I don't know how many, but I've read, but it's an enormous amount of weight that I can't feature machinery today being able to move. That's some of the lifting blocks, and they never took out underground level. They left them in. And that's some of the pavers, size of the stones on the floor of the street and the Temple Mount. And this is how Herod had them build their walls. They would set the stones in place, no mortar, just a little rock dust in between, yet it's very tight. And then they would chisel out the borders around it. And it was so important to him for looks that even where they went into bedrock and had a sheer wall cut out of the mountain, they still continued with those grooves to make it match the stone block wall. We come to the end of the street. A couple more things I wanted to show you we didn't get to see before. This is King David Hotel, where presidents and kings stayed and have for quite a number of years now. Some of them stay at a different place, but in behind it is a little park where there's a grave back here, and with a rolling stone and a door over it that's sometimes open and not. This is said to be Herod's family tomb. Now, Herod was buried on a mountain that was man-made, the Herodium, in a palace that was above the handmade mountain. And yet, he had his family buried in places like this. Another thing we saw a lot of was pictures of this guy in times past. His name's Schneerson, Rabbi Schneerson from New York City. A lot of Jews believe he was the Messiah. They were, in every way, they thought he was going to be the Messiah. They even built this building trying to get him to move to Israel. It's an exact copy of his home in New York. He's died now, and they've turned that into a park there in Israel. But some Jews are going back and looking at the scriptures and seeing scriptures refer to resurrection, and they're acting hopeful that they think maybe that Rabbi Schneerson will somehow be resurrected and come back and prove that he's the Messiah. So that's quite an interesting tidbit there. As we travel around, one thing I saw that I thought was amazing was the usage still of rooftops. You know, Rahab dried flax, all the different things in the Bible where they use the rooftops. Well, they're still hanging laundry out and got water heaters up there and satellite dishes. We took a walk around the outer walls of the city in 2011 and came out to past these guys that were doing a little repairs on a rickety ladder, and came out on the Damascus, down the steps to the Damascus Gate. From the Damascus Gate, we go into the section on Yom Yeshua. Yom means day, Yeshua is Christ, Messiah. So it's the day of Messiah that we're going to do on our last day of the trip. We go up to the Mount of Olives at the beginning of the day, and we see this iconographic view that's similar to so many that you see on pictures and catalogs and calendars and all those things of city of Jerusalem with the Temple Mount, the Gold Dome, the plaza there, the Temple Mount area, the outer wall, the eastern gate. Down in here is the Kidron Valley, and down there is the Garden of Gethsemane. we descend that area. As we go down, we see a lot of different graves. Some of the very old graves are carved right out of the mountain. One of them is said to be the tomb of Absalom, and somewhere in there they say that Jehoshaphat is buried, and there's a prediction that there will be a battle in the valley of Jehoshaphat, kind of the Armageddon thing. So it may even be a battle before the coming of Christ that happens right there in the Kidron Valley. So you see the East Gate and all the Arab cemetery and all that kind of thing. We passed down by these churches. This is, I think, Russian Orthodox, and this is the church where I believe the Catholics have to commemorate Christ sweating tears of blood, and pass thousands of Jewish graves. We come to the olive grove at the bottom, which is the Garden of Gethsemane. Gethsemane means olive press. So it was a place of pressing and pressure and all that kind of thing where Christ prayed the night before he was crucified. This is some of the olive trees there and different features around them. One back here is interesting. The trees start to fall over, they build stone pillars to prop them up. And see all these branches coming out. Some of these trees are very old, but then they sprout new branches. This tree here next to the church is said to be 2,000 years old. That may have been grown at the time of Christ. Then we look out toward the east and we wait for our bus and we drive off to a place called Caiaphas's house. Now, this is a Catholic church over an area that has a dungeon underneath that they believe may very well have been the place where Christ was tried before his crucifixion. You go out alongside of it and you see this artist sculpture here on the side of a wall, and you look down next to that and you see these paths or streets. They say that this street was there at the time of Christ, and that may have even been a place where he was drugged to be tried with some of the artifacts of homes around it. Okay, so the next one, we're coming up that street here, and there's this plaza here, this courtyard, and in that courtyard is this statue commemorating Peter denying Christ 3 times, before the cock crowed 3 times. And looking off to the southeast, down in the valley of Gehenna, this is a place where babies were offered to the pagan god Molech, but it's also the place where they think maybe the potter's field was. They call it the field of blood. And, man, I can't keep my finger right. Somewhere in this area, it may be that it was called the field of blood because of the drainage of the blood from sacrifices and the sewer lines coming out of the city from the Temple Mount. Each night they washed it off. And it may have been that stuff all would wash down the Kidron Valley and into this area. We enter the gates of this church, and there are beautiful doors on the front of it, and go downstairs to what they call the sacred pit and the underground caves, and we come to this thing that's kind of like a cistern. It's disturbed me that these lights look like they do. They look like snakes. But when you look upward, you see in this area there's crosses carved into the port into that area where people would have been lowered into the dungeon, so to speak. And that's from the time of the Byzantines, I think. So that's one reason they think this may have been a significant place. We go back down this road and head toward the Antonia Fortress where Christ was took, where Pilate was his seat of authority, and where he was convicted, I guess, at the last minute. And this is the north wall of the temple. Boy, this is the north wall of the old city, and of course, it doesn't show the slab rock again, but from there we see that area where the north wall was, and Golgotha off to the side of it, and Christ would have been tried there, come out, one theory is, would have come out the Damascus Gate, been taken over here, and be crucified in the area of Golgotha. So there is a Damascus Gate. This is the time of the Turks, but they dug down below, and this is, they believe, the time of Christ, the Damascus Gate that was there from the time of Christ. And you look a little bit north, and that's Solomon's Quarry entrance there that I talked about earlier. And when you look from Solomon's Quarry straight across past a bus station to the, I guess, north, you see this big cave here. So we're going to walk from there down around the corner, past these buildings, and come to up a street to the Garden Tomb area. The Garden Tomb, this is some old pictures of it from, I don't know, 100 years or farther ago, and what it looked like back in the day. And that cave we saw in the bus area was this thing right there. And if you look here, this is thought to have been the place of the skull. Skull Hill, they call it. Today, we pass into the lush and beautiful area, the Garden Tomb area, pass through this garden and come to a place where we have an overlook to see Skull Hill today. Now, last fall, the erosion had been such that the bridge of the nose here had been kind of eroded away, so it was like a boulder here and kind of the eyes connected. But it's been, you know, it's had that look for a long time, similar to that. So we go on down the path and around the corner from that, and we come to a spot here that this structure, and this is an entry to a cistern that is one of the proving indicators of this being a rich man's garden, that Christ was said to be buried in a rich man's garden. Inside that cistern looks like this. It would have held thousands and thousands of gallons of water to water grapevines and olive trees and all those kind of things. And so that is an indicator it may have been a rich man's garden. And also in that area they found this first century wine press. And it's been dressed up some, I'm sure, since then, but I think this was from it was from the very time of Christ that wine press was there. Then we go down a little farther and come down the steps and we see the Garden Tomb. Now, this thing was found, when this thing was found, dirt was clear up in here. And a man was digging a cistern, and as he dug down, he punched through a wall here where these repair stones are, and he found a tomb inside. And on good advice, he didn't dig the cistern there, but eventually Christian organizations bought this property and have developed it to what it is today. But the reasons they think that this may have been truly Christ's tomb, there's several. There's indicators here at A and D and D that those may have been rests for sidewall beams and a center beam for a roof over a chapel. The round rolling stone would have been where that dashed line is. B is where there's an iron pin that's been broke off that might have been a seal that held it in place. This notch in the doorway here is believed that everything above that notch was broken out later. The original door, they think, was at this height, which would fit for Mary stooping to look into the tomb. Then there's a big trough here, F, that they think may have been a trough that the rolling stone was a track for that, so to speak. And then G is a place they think was hollowed out for foot washing. So here's a man I went with in 2011 pointing out the iron pin. He got permission from the Antiquities Department to drill with a tiny drill bit up at an angle and catch the outer edge and up into that pin, and caught it in an envelope, took the filings back to the Israeli Museum, and Antiquities Department had them analyze it, and they said it was first century Roman iron and lead. Now, all over the Roman Empire, the Roman Colosseum was built with a lot of iron pins and lead anchors. What they'd do is they'd drill it with a hand drill and a hammer, a star drill, drill a hole, and then pour molten lead into it, and then hammer the iron pin in before the lead set. Once the lead set, then that would anchor it in place, and so that was Roman lead anchors. Then this is the plan of the tomb, which also has things that lean toward the validity of this place. This area is a mourner's area. The main door coming in that had been widened out that I just showed you. This is a little air hole, they call it a nephesh, and that would have been ventilation for the tomb. These are unfinished graves here and here, and this is the grave they think Christ would have been laid in, and there's a little pillow here in the rock. And then this area was a spot that had been cut out for a shorter man, but then it looks like it had been hurriedly extended for a taller man's feet. And this is the rolling stone trough that we talked about, a different angle of that. Inside of the garden tomb is this painted cross and symbols here, and I'm not sure, I can't remember what the writing is. It's from a Byzantine period, so 400 or 500 years after Christ. Many years it was buried in the ground before the guy dug it up 100 years ago. And when they opened it up, they found this thing. A few times it's been retouched up so it doesn't fade, but it's a Byzantine cross from a few hundred years after the resurrection. This is a picture of the area where the placement of the feet was hollowed out more. And this is the door as we leave the place. He's not here, he's risen. Now as we leave the garden tomb, pass through all this beauty and heading off to get on the plane and head home. And I think back to the first morning we woke up by the Sea of Galilee, and Monique and I watched the sunrise and saw a cross in the clouds. And it reminds me over and over of this picture, who, I think it was Terry, but someone sent me right after we got back the first time. This was after the baptism in the Jordan River, and I'm reminded to never let these things slip from my heart. With that, I'm going to end, and I want to thank you guys for giving me the honor of sharing these things and the privilege of spending this time. So thank you.